On the morning of D-Day, the German 15th Army had the power to crush the Allied invasion in hours. They had 18 divisions. They had the heaviest panzer tanks in France. And they were sitting just 150 miles away from the beaches where Americans were dying. But they didn't move. They didn't fire a shot. They just watched and waited. Because the German High Command was convinced that Normandy was a trap. They were waiting for the real invasion. They were waiting for the only general they truly feared. And they were willing to lose the war just to make sure they were ready for George Patton. There was just one problem. George Patton's army didn't exist. June 6, 1944, 2 a.m. German officers at 15th Army headquarters in Calais had received the first reports hours earlier. Allied paratroopers were landing in Normandy. Ships were approaching the beaches 150 miles to the southwest. The officers studied their maps and made calculations. Normandy was defended by second-rate divisions, static coastal units with limited mobility. If the Allies were serious about invading France, they wouldn't attack there. They would attack at Calais. The Pas de Calais was the obvious invasion point, only 21 miles from England across the Dover Strait. The shortest route to Germany, the fastest path to the Ruhr industrial region. Every strategic analysis pointed to Calais, and Germany's 15th Army was ready. 17 to 18 divisions, over 200,000 men, panzer units with heavy armor, the best-equipped army in France positioned exactly where the invasion would come. At 9 a.m., Wehrmacht High Command was analyzing the situation. Multiple reports confirmed major Allied landings at Normandy. But one critical question dominated every strategic discussion. Where was General Patton? Because if Patton was still in England, then Normandy was a feint. If Patton hadn't moved, then the real invasion was still coming. And when Patton came, Germany's 15th Army would be waiting for him. But there was one critical piece of intelligence the German High Command had gotten completely wrong, something that would keep 17 to 18 German divisions idle while Allied forces fought their way into France. To understand why German commanders spent D-Day waiting for Patton instead of reinforcing Normandy, you have to understand how Germany viewed Allied generals. They had fought them all. They had studied their tactics. They knew their strengths and weaknesses. Montgomery was predictable, methodical. He prepared extensively and attacked cautiously. The Germans could handle Montgomery because they understood him. He would never take risks. He would never move faster than his supply lines. Eisenhower was a politician in a uniform, good at coordination, skilled at keeping allies working together. But he had no combat experience before 1942. The Germans didn't fear him as a battlefield commander. Bradley was competent and careful, a solid professional who followed doctrine. The Germans respected him, but they weren't terrified of him. He would do what the textbook said to do. And then there was George S. Patton, Jr. In March 1943, American forces in Tunisia had been routed at Kasserine Pass. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had smashed through inexperienced American troops and sent them running. The American army looked incompetent. Its soldiers looked like they couldn't fight. Then Patton arrived. Within 2 weeks, the same American units that had been defeated were winning battles. They weren't just fighting better. They were fighting with an aggression that shocked German commanders. Patton didn't prepare methodically like Montgomery. He attacked immediately. He didn't wait for perfect conditions. He created opportunities through speed and violence. In Sicily, July 1943, Montgomery's British 8th Army was supposed to lead the invasion. Patton's 7th Army was supposed to protect Montgomery's flank. Instead, Patton raced across Sicily and captured Palermo, while Montgomery's forces were still fighting their way north. German commanders watched this and took notes. Patton was different. Patton was dangerous. Rommel himself had studied Patton's tactics. After the North Africa campaign, Rommel wrote assessments of Allied commanders for Wehrmacht High Command. His evaluation of Patton was blunt and disturbing. According to post-war German military studies, Rommel told Hitler's staff that Patton understood mobile warfare in ways other Allied commanders didn't. He moved faster than his logistics should allow. He attacked when conventional doctrine said to consolidate. He won through audacity when careful planning would have failed. General Gunther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to the German commander in the West, would later state in post-war interrogations, "We regarded General Patton extremely highly as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies, a man of incredible initiative and lightning-like action. This wasn't respect. This was fear. The Germans had fought Patton and learned that when he attacked, their defensive positions didn't hold. Their carefully prepared lines collapsed. Their veteran units retreated." By early 1944, German commanders had reached a consensus. If the Allies were planning the invasion of France, and if they wanted it to succeed, they would give the attack to Patton. He was their best general. He was the one who could break through and exploit a breakthrough before Germany could respond. So when German intelligence in early 1944 reported that Patton was in Dover, across from Calais, the Wehrmacht's conclusion was obvious. Patton would lead the invasion. He would attack at Calais. Everything else was distraction. The Germans were right about one thing. Patton was the most dangerous Allied commander. What they didn't know was that by April 1944, Patton wasn't commanding anything real. August 3rd, 1943. Patton walked into the 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia, Sicily. He was touring medical facilities, talking to wounded soldiers, doing what commanders do. He approached Private Charles Kuhl, who was sitting on a bed. Kuhl had no visible wounds, no bandages, no blood. Just a 1,000-yard stare. Patton asked what was wrong. Kuhl said he couldn't take the shelling anymore. He couldn't go back to the front. His nerves were shattered. Patton exploded. He called Kuhl a coward. He slapped him across the face with his gloves. He pulled his ivory-handled pistol and threatened to shoot him right there in the hospital tent. Medical staff had to physically intervene to stop Patton from executing a soldier for combat fatigue. 1 week later, August 10th, Patton did it again. Another hospital. Another shell-shocked soldier. Another explosion of rage. This time, dozens of medical personnel witnessed it. Doctors were horrified. Nurses were stunned. Reports went up the chain of command within hours. War correspondents knew about both incidents within days. They had witnesses. They had statements from medical staff. They had a story that would destroy the most successful American general in the Mediterranean. But they agreed not to publish it. Not yet. They gave Eisenhower time to handle it quietly. Eisenhower faced an impossible choice. Patton had just won the Sicily campaign. He had captured Palermo and reached Messina before the British. He was America's most successful battlefield commander. But he had also assaulted soldiers who were suffering from psychological wounds that military doctors recognized as legitimate medical conditions. By regulations, Patton should be court-martialed immediately. He should be relieved of command and sent home in disgrace. Eisenhower made a political calculation. He couldn't fire Patton. He needed him for the invasion of France. Patton's aggressive tactics would be essential for the breakout from the beaches. So Eisenhower privately reprimanded Patton. He ordered him to apologize to the soldiers, to the medical staff, and to every division in 7th Army. But he didn't court-martial him. He didn't relieve him. He kept Patton in theater. The decision became public in November 1943 when radio commentator Drew Pearson broke the story. The American public was outraged. Congressmen demanded Patton be fired. Veterans organizations called for his court-martial. But by then, Planning for D-Day was well underway, and Eisenhower had already made a decision about what to do with Patton. He couldn't give him combat command immediately. The public relations disaster was too recent. Congress was watching. But he could give Patton a command that would help the invasion succeed. A command that would use Patton's greatest weapon against Germany. Not his tactical skill, not his aggressive leadership, his reputation. December 1943. Eisenhower had been named Supreme Allied Commander for Operation Overlord, the invasion of France. He faced a problem that kept him awake at night. The Germans knew an invasion was coming. They didn't know when. They didn't know exactly where. But they knew it was coming in 1944. And they had spent 3 years fortifying the French coast, the Atlantic Wall. Thousands of concrete bunkers, millions of mines, beach obstacles, artillery positions covering every possible landing site. The strongest defenses were at Calais. That's where Germany expected the invasion. That's where they had concentrated their best troops. If the Allies attacked at Calais, the Germans would be ready. The actual invasion was planned for Normandy. The beaches were less heavily defended. The terrain was more suitable for a large-scale landing. The Allies could establish a beachhead before Germany could respond. But only if Germany didn't figure out where the attack was coming. The problem was that Normandy was an obvious second choice. Once the invasion started, Germany would immediately begin moving reinforcements. Panzer divisions would rush from other sectors. Within days, the Allies could be facing Germany's best armored units. The invasion could fail. Tens of thousands of Allied soldiers could die on the beaches. The war could be extended by years. Unless Germany was convinced that Normandy was a diversion. British intelligence proposed Operation Fortitude. It was one of the most ambitious deception operations in military history. The plan was to convince Germany that the real invasion would come at Calais, not Normandy. They would create a phantom army, a force that appeared massive on paper and looked real from German reconnaissance. An army that would be positioned at Dover, across from Calais, preparing to invade. The deception included rubber tanks that could be inflated in minutes, wooden aircraft that looked real from the air, fake landing craft in harbors, radio traffic suggesting divisions that didn't exist. Most importantly, the deception required a commander, someone Germany would believe was leading the invasion, someone whose presence at Dover would convince the Wehrmacht that Calais was the target. There was only one choice. Only one Allied commander whose name would make Germany keep its best divisions waiting. Only one general whose reputation would be more convincing than any amount of fake equipment. George S. Patton, Jr. Eisenhower made the decision in January 1944. Patton would command the 1st United States Army Group. He would be based at Dover. German intelligence would see him there. German agents would report his location. And Germany would conclude that wherever Patton was, that's where the invasion was coming. It was brilliant strategy. It would save thousands of lives. It would make D-Day possible. There was just one problem. Patton didn't know his army was fake. Not yet. January 1944. Patton was called to a meeting with Eisenhower in London. He had been in North Africa and Sicily. He had been sidelined since the slapping incidents. He was desperate to get back into the war. Eisenhower told him the situation. D-Day was being planned. The invasion would be the largest military operation in history. Millions of men, thousands of ships. The outcome would determine whether the war ended in 1944 or dragged on for years. Patton listened. He knew what was coming. Eisenhower was going to give him a command. Finally, after months of humiliation, he was going to lead troops again. Eisenhower explained Operation Fortitude, the deception plan, the need to convince Germany that the invasion was coming at Calais, the phantom army that would threaten the Pas-de-Calais while the real invasion hit Normandy. Then Eisenhower said the words that would define Patton's next 6 months. "I'm giving you command of the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG. You'll be based at Dover." Patton's face lit up. FUSAG. An entire army group, multiple armies, hundreds of thousands of men. It sounded like the most important command in the European theater. Eisenhower kept talking. FUSAG would be the most critical element of Operation Fortitude. German intelligence was watching Patton. They feared him more than any other Allied commander. If they saw him at Dover, they would believe the invasion was coming at Calais. Patton asked about his divisions. Which units would he command? When would they begin training for the invasion? Eisenhower paused. Then he explained the truth. FUSAG wasn't real. The divisions didn't exist. The tanks were rubber. The aircraft were wood. The landing craft were painted canvas. Patton would be commanding a deception. His job was to be visible at Dover, to let German reconnaissance photograph him, to generate radio traffic for non-existent units, to be the face of an army that was nothing but balloons and theater. The room was silent. Patton sat there processing what he had just been told. He was being asked to command a fraud, to babysit inflatable tanks, while other generals prepared to invade Europe. Eisenhower made the case. This wasn't a punishment. This was essential to the invasion's success. Patton's reputation would keep German divisions at Calais. His presence at Dover would save thousands of Allied lives. Without Patton, Operation Fortitude might fail. Without the deception, D-Day might fail. The entire war effort depended on Germany believing that George Patton was preparing to invade at Calais. Patton understood what was being asked. He understood why it mattered. But understanding something doesn't make it hurt less. Patton accepted the command. He didn't have a choice. Refusing would mean no command at all. He would spend the rest of the war behind a desk in Washington, watching other men win battles. So in February 1944, Patton moved to Dover. He established headquarters for the 1st United States Army Group. He played his part. But the part was nothing like commanding an army. His job was to be seen, to be visible, to let German spies photograph him and report his location back to Berlin. April 1944. Patton sat through another luncheon at the Dover Town Hall. Local dignitaries, British civic leaders, ladies' auxiliary groups. He gave speeches about Allied cooperation. He posed for photographs with the mayor. He shook hands and made pleasant conversation. This was his command. Public appearances, civic ceremonies, making sure German intelligence knew exactly where he was. To a warrior like Patton, this was torture. He was 58 years old. He had spent 35 years in the army studying warfare. He had commanded troops in World War I. He had developed doctrine for tank warfare. And now he was sipping tea with the mayor while Bradley planned D-Day. Bradley was preparing to command real armies for D-Day. He was selecting his staff, training his divisions, planning operations that would liberate France. Montgomery was commanding the 21st Army Group, British and Canadian forces, real soldiers who would storm the beaches at Normandy. Even junior American generals were getting combat commands. Men Patton had mentored, officers who had learned tactics from him in North Africa. They were preparing for the invasion, and George S. Patton, Jr., the man who had saved the North Africa campaign, The general who had beaten Montgomery to Messina, America's most aggressive combat commander, was giving speeches to ladies' clubs in Dover. His staff tried to make the best of it. They treated Fusag like a real command. They wrote realistic orders. They maintained detailed records. They coordinated with the deception units. They made sure Patton's public appearances seemed natural and unforced. But everyone knew the truth. Patton's friends were embarrassed for him. His enemies were delighted. The general who had slapped soldiers for cowardice was now the face of a propaganda operation. Some were less diplomatic. Patton heard the jokes, heard about officers calling Fusag the Ghost Army, or Patton the Phantom General. He wrote to his wife Beatrice in March 1944. The letter was bitter. "I am to be a decoy duck," he wrote. "At least I will be helping the invasion succeed, even if I am doing it by attending luncheons." He didn't mention how it felt. He didn't talk about watching other commanders prepare for real operations while he cut ribbons at civic ceremonies. He didn't write about the fury he felt every time he had to smile for photographers and pretend Fusag was preparing to invade. Late at night, in his quarters at Dover, Patton faced the brutal truth. Eisenhower didn't trust him. The slapping incidents had proven that Patton couldn't control himself, that he was too aggressive, too unpredictable, too likely to create diplomatic incidents. So they made him a decoy. They put him where he could help without causing problems. They used his reputation while keeping him away from real soldiers. Imagine being the man Rommel feared. Imagine knowing that your enemies respected your skills more than your own superiors did. And then imagine spending your days giving speeches to civic groups, so German spies would photograph you and confirm you were still at Dover. Patton had one consolation, one thing that kept him going through the humiliation. The knowledge that when Germany saw him at Dover, attending these public events, they would believe the invasion was coming at Calais. His reputation was going to save Allied lives, even if he did it by shaking hands at charity dinners. Dover, England, spring 1944. Operation Fortitude was the largest military deception in history. It involved thousands of people, millions of dollars in fake equipment, and one critical element, making Germany believe it was real. The physical deception was elaborate. Rubber Sherman tanks that could be inflated and positioned in fields where German reconnaissance planes would photograph them. Wooden aircraft lined up on airfields. Fake landing craft in harbors made from painted canvas stretched over frames. From the ground, up close, the deception was obvious. But from 20,000 feet, through the lens of a reconnaissance camera, it looked real. German photo analysts would see massive Allied concentrations at Dover. They would count tanks, estimate divisions, and report to Wehrmacht High Command. But the physical props were only part of Operation Fortitude. The British had captured and turned every German agent in England. The double-cross system meant these spies were now sending Berlin exactly what the Allies wanted them to hear. These turned agents were now reporting detailed intelligence about Fusag. They described seeing massive American troop concentrations at Dover. They reported conversations with American soldiers preparing for invasion. They confirmed what German reconnaissance was showing. The radio deception was equally sophisticated. Fusag headquarters broadcast constant radio traffic, orders for imaginary divisions, supply requests for tanks that didn't exist, weather reports for units that weren't there. German signals intelligence intercepted these transmissions. They plotted the radio locations. They analyzed the message traffic. They concluded that Fusag was a massive army group preparing for invasion. But all of this The rubber tanks, the turned spies, the radio deception would only work if Germany believed one critical thing, that the commander was real. The British had the intelligence network. They had turned the spies, they had built the props, they had created the radio traffic. But props don't scare the Wehrmacht, commanders do. The deception didn't work because of rubber tanks or wooden aircraft. It worked because the Germans couldn't believe the Americans would leave their best general on the sidelines. It worked because Germany knew that if the Allies were serious about invading France, they would give the attack to Patton. So when German intelligence reported that Patton was at Dover, commanding Fusag, preparing for invasion, Wehrmacht High Command reached the obvious conclusion. Patton wouldn't be at Dover unless the invasion was coming at Calais. That's where the Allies would strike. That's where Germany needed to keep its best divisions, because when Patton came, it would be with overwhelming force and devastating speed. The irony was perfect. The British had the best intelligence operation in the war. They had captured the German spy network. They had mastered the art of deception. But Operation Fortitude succeeded for one reason. Because George Patton's reputation was more terrifying than any amount of real equipment. May 1944. Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft flew regular missions over southern England. The flights were dangerous. Allied air superiority meant German planes had to fly high and fast to avoid being shot down. But the intelligence was essential. Germany needed to know where the Allies were concentrating forces, where the invasion was being prepared, which ports were filling with landing craft. The reconnaissance photos from Dover were alarming. Every mission showed more Allied equipment, more tanks in the fields, more aircraft on the airfields, more landing craft in the harbors. German photo analysts counted the equipment and estimated troop strength. They briefed Wehrmacht High Command on what they were seeing. Massive Allied buildup opposite Calais, 1st U.S. Army Group, estimated strength 50 divisions. 50 divisions. Over 1 million men. The largest force the Americans had assembled in the European theater, and all of it positioned to strike at the Pas de Calais. But photographs weren't the only intelligence Germany was receiving. German agents in England were sending reports. These were men Germany trusted, agents who had been operating in Britain for years. Men who had proven their reliability. Their reports confirmed what the reconnaissance photos showed. Fusag was real. The American buildup at Dover was massive. And most importantly, General George S. Patton was in command. One agent's report from April 1944 was particularly convincing. He described seeing Patton at Dover personally, described his distinctive appearance, the riding boots, the ivory-handled pistols, the no-nonsense command presence. The agent reported that Patton was actively preparing Fusag for invasion. What the Germans didn't know was that their trusted agent was working for British intelligence. The report was fiction, carefully crafted fiction designed to reinforce what German reconnaissance was showing. Wehrmacht High Command analyzed all the intelligence. The geography made Calais the obvious choice. The shortest crossing, the quickest route to Germany, the best ports for follow-on operations. Every strategic textbook said the Allies would attack at Calais. The troop concentrations confirmed it. The equipment buildup confirmed it. And most convincingly, Patton's presence confirmed it. Geography told them Calais was the target. Logic told them Calais was the target. But Patton was the confirmation that locked their minds shut. German military intelligence had studied Patton since North Africa. They knew he was America's most aggressive general. They knew he understood mobile warfare. They knew that when he attacked, German defenses collapsed. And now Patton was at Dover, commanding the largest American force in England, preparing to invade. In May 1944, Hitler personally reviewed the intelligence from Dover. He asked his staff about Allied intentions. They showed him the reconnaissance photos. They showed him the agent reports. They told him about Patton. Hitler made his decision. The 15th Army would stay at Calais. Germany's best panzer divisions would be positioned to defend against Patton's invasion. Whatever happened elsewhere was secondary. When Patton came, Germany would be ready. What they didn't know was that Patton's tanks were rubber. His aircraft were wood. His landing craft were canvas. And his army was a ghost. May 28, 1944. 9 days before D-Day. Wehrmacht High Command held a strategic review. The question was simple. Where would the Allies invade? The intelligence all pointed to Calais. 15th Army's commander reported the massive Allied buildup at Dover. Photo reconnaissance showed approximately 50 divisions preparing to embark. Radio intercepts confirmed intense activity in FUSAG headquarters, and Patton was there. The general Germany feared most. The commander who had shattered Rommel's tactics in North Africa. The aggressive, unpredictable American who won through speed and violence. Hitler's staff presented their assessment. The main invasion will come at Calais under Patton's command. Any attack elsewhere will be a diversion to draw our forces away from the real objective. 15th Army's position was strong. 18 divisions, 2 panzer divisions with heavy tanks, extensive fortifications along the coast, artillery covering every beach. If the Allies attacked at Calais, they would face Germany's best defenses and most experienced troops. The plan was clear. 15th Army would remain at Calais in full strength. No units would be transferred to other sectors. When Allied landing craft appeared off the Pas de Calais, Germany would be ready to destroy the invasion on the beaches. But the plan had one critical assumption, that Germany could identify when the real invasion was happening, that they would know the difference between a diversion and the main attack. The assumption was based on one fact, Patton. When Patton moved, that would be the real invasion. If Patton stayed at Dover, then any attack elsewhere was a feint. So as May ended and June approached, Germany waited. 15th Army sat at Calais with orders to be ready for immediate action. Panzer divisions maintained high alert. Coastal artillery was manned and prepared. And German intelligence watched Dover. Watched for signs that FUSAG was preparing to embark. Watched for Patton to move. On June 5, 1944, weather conditions across the English Channel deteriorated. Storms made invasion impossible. German commanders stood down from alert. June 5th would not be the day. That night, Allied aircraft began flying in massive numbers toward France. But German intelligence reported that Patton was still at Dover. FUSAG was still in position. The radio traffic from FUSAG headquarters continued normally. Whatever was happening that night, it couldn't be the main invasion. Not without Patton. At 2 a.m. on June 6th, the first reports arrived at Wehrmacht headquarters. Paratroopers landing in Normandy. Allied ships approaching the beaches. A massive invasion was underway. But it was 150 miles from Calais, and Patton hadn't moved. The question Germany now faced would determine whether the invasion succeeded or failed. The question that Operation Fortitude had been designed to create. The question that 18 German divisions at Calais were waiting to answer. Was Normandy the real invasion? Or was it a diversion before Patton struck at Calais? But here's the part of the story most people forget. The deception didn't work perfectly. In fact, on the morning of D-Day, the trap actually broke. At 4:30 a.m. on June 6th, Field Marshal von Rundstedt realized the truth. He looked at the reports from Normandy and saw the scale of the landings. He realized this wasn't a raid. Rundstedt didn't wait for permission. He ordered 2 elite panzer divisions at Calais to move immediately toward Normandy. He commanded them to prepare for immediate counterattack. If those tanks had continued moving, they would have hit the Americans at Omaha Beach by the afternoon. The invasion would have been crushed. But at 7 a.m., the phone rang at Rundstedt's headquarters. It was Hitler, and he was furious. Hitler had just been woken up with the news. Allied invasion at Normandy. Massive landings. Thousands of ships. His first instinct was to send everything to stop them. But his intelligence officers showed him the reports from Dover. Fusag was still there. Patton hadn't moved. The radio traffic from Fusag headquarters continued normally. All the reconnaissance photos showed American equipment still positioned across from Calais. Rundstedt was on the phone arguing for immediate reinforcement to Normandy. The panzer divisions needed to move now before the beachhead was secure. But Hitler's question was direct. Where is Patton? Is Normandy the real invasion, or is it a diversion? At that exact moment, 6:30 a.m., American forces were storming Omaha Beach. German defenders were firing from concrete bunkers. Men were dying in the surf. Landing craft were burning. The invasion was hanging by a thread. If the panzer divisions from Calais had kept moving, they would have arrived by afternoon. The Americans at Omaha might not have held. Hitler made his decision. His words were recorded in the war diary kept by Wehrmacht operations staff. The 15th Army will remain in place at Calais. We cannot afford to strip forces from the Pas de Calais until we know with certainty that the main Allied attack has been committed. He ordered Rundstedt to recall the panzers, cancel the movement order. The tanks turned around and went back to Calais. 15th Army received its orders. Remain at Calais. Maintain full defensive readiness. Do not send reinforcements to Normandy. The main Allied attack was still coming. While American soldiers fought and died on Omaha Beach, while British forces struggled to capture Caen, while paratroopers fought desperately to hold their objectives, Germany's best divisions sat idle at Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come, waiting for an army that didn't exist, waiting for George Patton. June 7th, 1944. 24 hours after D-Day. The fighting at Normandy was desperate. Allied forces had established a beachhead, but it was fragile. German reinforcements were arriving. Panzer divisions were moving toward the battle, but not from Calais. 15th Army hadn't moved. Hitler's orders were clear. Calais was where the main invasion was coming. Normandy was a diversion. Don't fall for the trick. At Dover, Operation Fortitude continued. Fusag maintained its radio traffic. German reconnaissance still photographed the equipment at Dover. The rubber tanks sat in their fields. The wooden aircraft sat on their airfields. And somewhere in England, though German intelligence didn't know where, Patton watched the invasion unfold without him. June 21st, 15 days after D-Day. The Normandy campaign was clearly the main Allied effort. No one at Wehrmacht High Command seriously believed it was a diversion anymore. The scale was too large, the commitment was too deep. But 15th Army still hadn't been ordered to Normandy. Not all of it. Not immediately. Because what if they were wrong? What if Patton did attack at Calais after 15th Army was transferred away? Germany couldn't take that risk. So they compromised. Some units from 15th Army were finally sent to Normandy, but slowly, carefully, maintaining enough force at Calais to defend against Patton's attack. The delay would be measured in weeks, and every week the Germans spent worrying about Calais was another week the Allies had to consolidate their beachhead. Think about what was happening. American and British soldiers were fighting through hedgerows in Normandy. They were taking casualties, fighting for every village, struggling to break out of the beachhead. And 150 miles away, 18 German divisions were doing nothing. They were sitting in defensive positions, waiting for an invasion that existed only in their imagination. Waiting because George Patton's reputation was more convincing than reality. By the time significant forces from 15th Army finally arrived at Normandy in early July, the Allied beachhead was secure. Supplies were flowing across the beaches. Reinforcements were arriving daily. The window for destroying the invasion had closed. Operation Fortitude had worked. Patton's Ghost Army had paralyzed German decision-making at the most critical moment of the invasion. Thousands of Allied soldiers owed their lives to rubber tanks and one general's reputation. June 1944. While German 15th Army sat frozen at Calais, real Allied armies were fighting in Normandy. And the contrast between German reactions revealed something striking about how the Wehrmacht viewed different Allied commanders. Montgomery's British Second Army was attacking Caen. This was a real British force. Real tanks, real soldiers, fierce, determined fighting. Montgomery had planned this operation for months. He was executing it with his characteristic thoroughness. The Germans fought back hard at Caen. They sent reinforcements. They committed panzer divisions. They pulled units from other sectors of the Normandy front to stop Montgomery's advance. But they pulled those units from within Normandy. They shuffled forces around the battlefield. They took calculated risks with other positions to reinforce against Montgomery. What they didn't do was pull forces from Calais. Think about what that means. The Germans were willing to move troops to fight Montgomery because they knew they could stop him. They understood his tactics. They knew he would advance methodically. They could prepare defensive positions and wear him down through attrition. But at Calais, 150 miles away, 18 divisions sat completely idle. They didn't move. Not one battalion was sent to help at Caen. Not one panzer division was transferred to stop Montgomery. Why? Because the Germans weren't sure they could stop Patton if he landed at Calais. They had fought him before. They knew what happened when he broke through defensive lines. They knew his forces didn't stop to consolidate. They knew he exploited breakthroughs faster than any Allied commander. But Patton? Patton at Dover commanding Fusag? That was different. The German High Command was so terrified of what Patton might do at Calais that they refused to move forces to fight Montgomery's real army. They respected Patton's rubber tanks more than Montgomery's steel. This was the ultimate measure of how Germany viewed Allied commanders. Montgomery was fighting them with real divisions, and they were willing to take risks to contain him. Patton was sitting at Dover with balloons, and they wouldn't dare move forces away from where he might attack. By late June, German commanders at Caen were begging for reinforcements. They were facing Montgomery's full force. They needed panzer divisions. They needed infantry. They needed help. And Hitler's headquarters kept asking, "Where is Patton? Has he moved? Is he still at Dover?" The answer kept coming back. Still at Dover. Still commanding Fusag. Still preparing to attack. So Caen didn't get the reinforcements it needed. Not from Calais. Because even with Montgomery attacking, even with British tanks pushing toward the city, even with real combat happening in front of them, the Germans were more afraid of what Patton might do. That was the difference. Montgomery was fighting the Germans. Patton was paralyzing them. The German High Command couldn't believe the Americans would keep their best general out of the real fight. They couldn't accept that Fusag was a deception. Because if Patton was fake, what did that say about German intelligence? What did that say about Wehrmacht's ability to read Allied intentions? It was easier to believe Normandy was the diversion. Easier to believe that any day now Patton would unleash his army at Calais and prove the Germans had been right all along. So they kept waiting, and Montgomery kept fighting, and Patton's ghost army kept 18 German divisions frozen at Calais while real Allied forces won the battle for Normandy. July 1944. Military analysts were already asking the critical question. What difference did those 3 weeks make? What would have happened if 15th Army had been at Normandy from the start? The numbers were stark. 15th Army included 2 panzer divisions at Calais. These weren't ordinary infantry units. These were Germany's elite armored formations. Tigers, Panthers, Panzer IVs, experienced crews, combined arms tactics. The 116th Panzer Division had 160 tanks and 15,000 men. It was considered one of the best divisions in the Wehrmacht, and it spent June 6th through June 28th sitting idle at Calais, waiting for Patton. The 1st SS Panzer Division was also held at Calais. Another 160 tanks, another elite formation. It finally moved to Normandy on July 1st, 25 days after D-Day. That's 320 elite tanks sitting idle, while Americans were dying on the beaches. Think about what those 2 divisions could have done at Omaha Beach on June 6th. American forces there were barely hanging on. Small arms fire from the cliffs was devastating. German defenders were few in number, but perfectly positioned. If 2 panzer divisions had counterattacked Omaha Beach on June 7th, the Americans might not have held. The beachhead was that fragile. The margin between success and failure was that thin. Military historians have run the analysis repeatedly. The conclusion is consistent. If 15th Army's panzer divisions had been committed to Normandy on June 6th or 7th, D-Day would have been much more difficult. Possibly too difficult. By late June, Allied forces at Normandy had linked up their beachheads. They were pushing inland. The invasion was succeeding, but every day made it more secure. Every day reduced the chance that Germany could push the Allies back into the sea. June 25th, 19 days after D-Day, German High Command finally accepted that Normandy was real. They weren't going to push the Allies back into the sea. The invasion had succeeded. But they still weren't sure about Calais. Were the Americans planning a second invasion? Would Patton's Fusag still attack? Could there be 2 invasion fronts? So 15th Army stayed at Calais, not at full strength anymore. Some units were being transferred to Normandy, but slowly, carefully. July 1st. The Germans were finally committing significant reinforcements from 15th Army to Normandy. But it had taken 3 weeks. 3 weeks when those divisions could have been at the beachhead. 3 weeks when they could have made the fighting harder for Allied forces. At minimum, Allied casualties would have been doubled. The fighting would have been more intense. The beachhead would have been smaller and more precarious. At worst, the invasion might have failed. American forces might have been pushed back into the sea at Omaha. The entire operation might have been postponed for months. But that didn't happen because of rubber tanks and radio deception. Because Germany believed George Patton was at Dover preparing to invade. Because Wehrmacht intelligence feared Patton's ghost more than they understood Allied intentions. By the time 15th Army's panzers finally arrived at Normandy in early July, the Allied beachhead was secure. Supplies were flowing across the beaches. Reinforcements were arriving daily. The window for destroying the invasion had closed. Operation Fortitude had kept that window closed long enough for real armies to win. Patton's inflatable army had given D-Day the 3 weeks it needed to become irreversible. Early July 1944. Operation Fortitude was ending. Not because the Allies stopped trying, because Germany finally accepted reality. The Normandy invasion was real. It was the main Allied effort. There wasn't going to be a second landing at Calais. Fusag was a deception, and Patton had been commanding balloons while other generals invaded France. Wehrmacht intelligence officers who had spent months tracking Fusag felt sick. They had been fooled. Completely, totally fooled. Every agent report had been false. Every reconnaissance photo had shown fake equipment. Every radio intercept had been deception. The Americans had made them look like amateurs. Worse, the strategic consequences were devastating. By the time Germany realized the truth and moved 15th Army to Normandy, the invasion was already succeeding. The beachhead was secure. Allied forces were preparing to break out. The opportunity to destroy the invasion on the beaches was gone. The chance to throw the Allies back into the sea was lost. And Germany had lost it because they spent 3 weeks defending against an army that didn't exist. On July 25, 1944, American forces launched Operation Cobra. This was the breakout from Normandy. General Omar Bradley's First Army punched through German lines at Saint-Lô. German defenses collapsed. Allied forces began racing across France. And on August 1st, 1944, something happened that must have felt like a sick joke to German commanders. Patton's Third Army became operational. It turned out Patton did have a real army. He had been given command of newly arrived American divisions, and now, after spending 6 months commanding rubber tanks, he was finally leading real soldiers in real combat. Within days, Third Army was advancing faster than any army in history. Patton was proving exactly why the Germans had been right to fear him. His tanks were covering 50 miles a day. His forces were liberating French towns so quickly that maps couldn't keep up. The irony was devastating for German commanders. They had spent D-Day waiting for Patton to attack at Calais. Now, 2 months later, Patton was attacking at Normandy, and he was every bit as dangerous as they had feared. By late August, Third Army had liberated most of western France. Patton's forces had reached the Seine River. They were approaching Paris. They were demonstrating the aggressive mobile warfare that German intelligence had warned would happen. The difference was that when it actually happened, Germany's best divisions were exhausted from fighting in Normandy for 2 months. They were out of position. They were retreating in confusion. They couldn't mount the coherent defense they might have organized if they had been properly positioned in June. Wehrmacht commanders were conducting postmortems on what went wrong. How had they been so completely deceived? How had they fallen for Operation Fortitude? The answer kept coming back to one factor: Patton. They had believed the deception because Patton was part of it. They couldn't imagine the Americans wasting their best general on a fake army. German intelligence had been right about one thing. Patton was the most dangerous Allied commander, the most aggressive, the most capable of exploitation, the one who would move fastest and hit hardest. They just hadn't realized that his reputation alone could paralyze 18 German divisions while Allied forces invaded. August 1st, 1944. George S. Patton, Jr. finally had what he had wanted for 6 months: a real army, real soldiers, real tanks that actually moved. Third Army consisted of 4 corps, 12 divisions, over 250,000 men, and Patton was going to make up for lost time. His orders were to exploit the Cobra breakout, to advance through Brittany and capture ports for Allied logistics. It was a conservative mission: secure the supply lines, don't take risks. Patton looked at the map and saw a chance to end the war. He sent a small force to Brittany to satisfy orders and threw the entire weight of Third Army east toward Germany. Within 1 month, Third Army had advanced 400 miles. They liberated Le Mans, Chartres, and Orléans. They reached the Seine River and threatened Paris from the south. It was the most rapid advance in American military history. The contrast was humiliating. Montgomery's British forces had been fighting at Caen since June 6th. By August, they had advanced roughly 50 miles in the 2 months. Patton covered more ground in 1 week than Montgomery had in 8 weeks. This was the Patton Gap. This was exactly what the Germans had feared. German commanders couldn't believe what they were seeing. They had spent June worrying about Patton at Dover. Now he was real, and he was worse than they had imagined. Patton's tactics were exactly what German intelligence had predicted. Aggressive movement, exploitation of opportunities, attacks before the enemy could consolidate, speed and violence overwhelming careful German defensive planning. Third Army didn't stop to consolidate positions, didn't wait for supply lines to catch up, didn't give the Germans time to establish new defensive lines. Patton kept his forces moving constantly, never letting the enemy rest. By August 31st, Third Army had reached the Meuse River, nearly 250 miles beyond where Eisenhower's staff had planned for them to be. Patton was approaching the German border. His forces were threatening the Siegfried Line. And the Germans who had spent D-Day defending against his rubber tanks were now facing his real army. The ghost had become flesh, and he was proving exactly why they had been right to fear him. In 6 weeks, Patton had gone from commanding balloons to liberating most of France, from the humiliation of Dover to the glory of the fastest advance in American military history. The Germans must have realized what Operation Fortitude had really accomplished. It hadn't just kept them from reinforcing Normandy in June. It had positioned Patton to be unleashed in August when German forces were exhausted and disorganized. They had feared him in June. They had been right to fear him. But by waiting for his fake army at Calais, they had made themselves vulnerable to his real army in Normandy. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, Allied intelligence interrogated German commanders. The interrogations were conducted by the U.S. Army's Historical Division. The goal was to understand German decision-making during the war. One question came up repeatedly. Why didn't you reinforce Normandy immediately on June 6th? Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who had been Commander-in-Chief West during D-Day, gave his answer. According to the Foreign Military Studies interview series, Rundstedt admitted the truth. We were convinced the main invasion would come at Calais under Patton's command. The Normandy landings appeared to be a diversion to draw our forces away from the real objective. The interviewer asked how long Germany maintained this belief. Rundstedt's response was devastating. For far too long. We kept the 15th Army at Calais for weeks after Normandy, waiting for Patton to attack. It was one of our greatest strategic mistakes of the war. General Günther Blumentritt, who had been chief of staff to Rundstedt, was even more explicit in his interrogation. We knew Patton was the most dangerous American commander. When intelligence showed he was at Dover commanding a massive army group, we assumed that's where the invasion would come. We couldn't believe the Americans would keep their best general out of their main operation. The interrogator pressed, "What convinced you Patton was the threat?" Blumentritt's answer confirmed what Allied intelligence had hoped. His reputation. We had fought him in North Africa and Sicily. He understood mobile warfare. He was aggressive and unpredictable. We feared him more than any other Allied general. Other German commanders gave similar testimony. General Siegfried Westphal, who had served under Rommel, stated that Patton's presence at Dover was the most convincing element of the Allied deception. We believed the intelligence about the buildup because we believed Patton wouldn't be there unless the attack was coming. The transcripts revealed something remarkable. Operation Fortitude had worked better than the Allies had hoped. Not only had the deception kept German forces at Calais, it had convinced the Wehrmacht's best commanders that they were making the right decision. Even weeks after D-Day, German High Command was still reluctant to strip forces from Calais. Not because they saw evidence of imminent attack, because they couldn't accept that they had been fooled about Patton. The interrogations also revealed German assessments of Allied commanders. When asked to rank Allied generals by capability, German officers consistently put Patton at the top. Montgomery was described as cautious and methodical. Eisenhower was skilled at coordination, but inexperienced in combat command. Patton was described as extremely dangerous, aggressive to the point of recklessness, understanding of mobile warfare superior to most Allied commanders. The final irony came when interrogators asked about Operation Fortitude itself. Some German commanders had heard after the war that Fusag was fake, that the tanks were rubber, that Patton had been commanding a deception. Their reactions were almost identical. Disbelief, then bitter realization of how completely they had been fooled. One German officer, whose name was redacted in the interrogation transcript, put it bluntly, "You made fools of us. You used our own intelligence analysis against us. We saw what we expected to see because we believed what we feared was true." But the most telling admission came from a panzer commander who had waited at Calais through June 1944. "We were defending against Patton's ghost while his real army was preparing to destroy us. When he finally came in August, we were exhausted, disorganized, and still trying to understand how we had been so wrong." In the end, Patton won the biggest battle of World War II without firing a shot. He paralyzed 18 German divisions with balloons and radio broadcasts. He saved thousands of Allied lives by making Germany defend against an army that didn't exist. The greatest compliment the Wehrmacht ever gave an Allied commander. They were so terrified of George Patton that they spent D-Day defending against rubber tanks while a real invasion conquered France. That was the power of reputation. That was the weapon Operation Fortitude had unleashed. Not tanks, not infantry, not firepower. Fear. And when Patton finally did get his real army in August 1944, he proved the Germans had been right to be afraid. He just proved it too late for them to do anything about it.